The American economy added jobs again last quarter. Consumer spending held steady. Corporate earnings, by most accounts, continued to climb. And yet, across the country, a significant share of working households will finish this month with almost nothing left. Not because they earned too little on paper, but because nearly every dollar they brought in had already been assigned to an obligation before it arrived. This is the contradiction at the center of modern economic life in developed nations. The system reports prosperity, while the people inside it experience fragility. And the distance between those two realities is not an accident. It is architecture. Consider someone like David, a logistics coordinator in his mid-30s, living outside a major metro area. He earns a solid salary by most conventional standards. He completed his degree, entered the workforce on time, and did what the prevailing advice told him to do: secure stable employment, build a career, manage his expenses responsibly. He does not carry luxury debt. He does not live extravagantly. On the surface, David is the model of a functioning middle-class professional, the kind of worker the economy supposedly rewards. But each month, after rent, car payments, student loan servicing, health insurance premiums, utilities, and basic household costs, his discretionary margin is negligible. Some months it is functionally zero. He is not reckless. He is not financially illiterate. He is simply operating inside a system where income is absorbed by obligations almost as fast as it is generated. And he cannot figure out why the math never seems to work in his favor. Most people believe that living paycheck to paycheck is a personal failure. The dominant cultural narrative frames it that way, as a problem of discipline, budgeting, or financial literacy. The assumed solution is familiar: earn more, cut unnecessary spending, build an emergency fund. Personal finance media reinforces this framing relentlessly. Employers echo it in benefits meetings. And the underlying implication is clear. If you are financially fragile, you must be doing something wrong. But this framing obscures a deeper pattern. It treats a structural outcome as an individual behavior. And in doing so, it prevents most people from understanding the actual mechanism that keeps them on the treadmill. The deeper reality is what might be called a cost absorption architecture. It works like this: when wages rise, whether through labor market tightness, policy changes, or career advancement, the cost of essential obligations tends to adjust in parallel, and in many cases, ahead of those gains. Housing costs, both rental and mortgage-driven, respond quickly to income expectations. Healthcare premiums and insurance products are priced against anticipated earnings capacity. Education-linked debt servicing is scaled to projected career income. The net effect is a compression dynamic. Households earn more in nominal terms while retaining roughly the same, or sometimes a shrinking, discretionary margin. The treadmill accelerates, but the distance covered stays the same. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how pricing functions in markets built around creditworthiness and income-based underwriting. Lending institutions extend credit based on what borrowers earn, which inflates the price of leveraged assets, housing being the most obvious. Employers design compensation structures knowing that benefits costs will consume a portion of total packages. The result is an economy where the income floor steadily rises, but the gap between what people earn and what they owe remains persistently compressed. If this type of structural economic analysis is something you find valuable, consider subscribing. We focus on long-form clarity, not headlines. This arrangement did not materialize suddenly. It developed across several decades through a series of structural shifts that individually appeared manageable, even beneficial, at the time of their introduction. The expansion of consumer credit access from the mid-20th century onward gave households the ability to smooth consumption across uneven income cycles. It enabled home purchases, automobile ownership, and higher education at scales previously unavailable to middle-income families. But it also introduced permanent debt servicing obligations into household budgets that had not previously carried them. What began as expanded access gradually became embedded cost. The gradual transfer of financial risk from institutions to individuals compounded this effect in ways that accumulated quietly over time. Defined benefit pensions gave way to individual retirement accounts. Employer-covered healthcare shifted toward high-deductible cost-sharing arrangements. Each transition moved a recurring cost line from the institutional column to the household column. None of these shifts were experienced as catastrophic in isolation, but their cumulative weight, layered across housing, healthcare, retirement, and education, reshaped household budgets at a structural level that most workers never fully accounted for. At the same time, the cost of non-negotiable goods, housing in productive metropolitan areas, post-secondary education, childcare, and medical care, grew at rates that persistently exceeded general inflation measures. Wage growth for middle-income cohorts, meanwhile, remained subdued relative to these essential categories for extended periods. The compounding effect, accumulated over 2 or 3 decades, is a household budget where fixed and semi-fixed obligations consume an outsized share of gross income. Nominal wage increases arrive, but they have little room to convert into genuine surplus. And the groups most affected are not always the ones you might expect. Yes, low-income households face acute versions of this pressure, but the structural exposure extends well into what most people would consider the professional middle class. Young professionals entering the workforce carry education-linked debt at a scale previous generations did not. Single-income households and those in high-cost metro areas face amplified versions of the same compression. Even dual-income professional households in many urban centers operate with thinner margins than their combined salaries would suggest, once housing, childcare, and transportation costs are accounted for. David's situation is not unusual. It is, in many ways, the norm for his demographic. The behavioral responses to this persistent compression are predictable and, importantly, rational. Credit utilization becomes a buffer. Short-term borrowing fills the gaps between pay cycles and irregular expenses. Lifestyle choices that appear discretionary from the outside. A streaming subscription, a convenience purchase, a modest upgrade, often function as psychological relief from the stress of constrained margins. Savings behavior becomes sporadic rather than systematic. Emergency funds are built and depleted in repeating cycles. Over time, many households develop a kind of financial fatigue, a state where long-term planning feels abstract and irrelevant against the immediacy of the next billing cycle. This is not irrationality. It is an adaptive response to a structural environment that makes short-term obligations inescapable, while penalizing long-horizon thinking. If you are following this analysis and want to see how these structural patterns evolve over time, subscribing is the best way to stay informed. The second-order effects of this dynamic ripple outward in ways that shape entire markets, and ultimately, the stability of the broader economy. Labor markets become less fluid when workers without financial reserves cannot afford to leave unfavorable employment, negotiate for better terms, or invest in the skill transitions that a shifting economy increasingly demands. People stay in roles not because the roles serve them, but because the alternative, even a brief period without income, is financially untenable. Consumer spending patterns become fragile, vulnerable to disruption from even minor shocks, like an unexpected repair bill or a brief gap in employment. Credit markets, recognizing this fragility, price accordingly, which creates a feedback loop where the cost of borrowing reinforces the very cycle it responds to. Housing markets in desirable areas continue to absorb income capacity, further limiting geographic mobility. At scale, the result is an economy that appears robust in aggregate consumption data, but is structurally brittle, capable of sharp contractions in response to relatively modest external shocks. So what does positioning look like within a system designed this way? It begins with a shift in framing. The analysis suggests that awareness itself constitutes a meaningful advantage. Not awareness in the abstract, but a specific understanding of how income is absorbed by the cost structures surrounding it. Recognizing that income growth alone does not resolve margin compression allows for more deliberate decision-making around the obligations that claim the largest share of household income, housing chief among them. It changes the calculus around what constitutes a good financial decision. Maintaining a degree of skepticism toward financial products and commitments that scale automatically with income is a sound defensive posture. Building even modest reserves, while genuinely difficult within this structure, creates disproportionate optionality relative to the effort involved. And perhaps most importantly, understanding that this is a structural condition, not a personal failing, allows for more strategic engagement with employment decisions, geographic choices, and long-term financial architecture. The goal is not to exit the system. It is to operate within it with clearer sightlines, making decisions that preserve flexibility rather than optimize for consumption capacity alone. Consistency matters more than intensity. Liquidity awareness matters more than income growth in isolation. David will go to work again tomorrow. He will earn his salary, pay his obligations, and find himself, once again, with a narrow margin between income and outflow. The advice he has received his entire adult life tells him this is his problem to solve. That with enough discipline, enough effort, the math will eventually break in his favor. But the math does not break in his favor, because the math was never designed to. The obligations scale with the income. The margin stays compressed. If you find this kind of structural analysis useful, and you want to understand the architecture beneath the headlines, subscribe to the channel. We will continue building this out, calmly, clearly, and without hype. The economy is not broken in the way most people assume. It is functioning precisely as its incentive structures dictate. The question is not whether you can earn your way out of the treadmill. The question is whether you can see the treadmill clearly enough to make different decisions about where you stand on it.